Welcome to the WTR Biotech Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Tim Gerdeman, Vice Chair and Co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Water Tower Research. In today's podcast episode, I'm being joined by Oren Hershkovitz, PhD, CEO of Enlivex Therapeutics, NASDAQ ticker symbol ENLV. Enlivex is a clinical stage, next generation immunotherapy company developing Allocetra, a universal off-the-shelf cell therapy designed to reprogram macrophages into the homeostatic state. Also joining us is my WTR Equity Research colleague, Do Kim. Good morning, gentlemen, and thank you for joining today's podcast.
Thanks, Tim.
Good morning, team. Good morning, Do. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks
Excited
for joining.
to be here.
Likewise. Oren, could you please tell our listeners about your professional background to kick things off and provide a brief overview of Enlivex's cell therapy platform, please?
Sure. So I'm the CEO of Enlivex for the past 6 years. Prior to that, I managed a company called Biologics that was originally founded in Israel as a garage company. I managed that and developed long-acting therapeutic drug. At some stage, we were acquired by Opco Health, a Miami-based pharmaceutical company. After which I became the general manager, and we did the licensing agreement with that a leading asset, a long-acting growth hormone back then. I worked with Pfizer for 5 years with a broad team, led the team in Israel, working with Pfizer, developing the late stage of that asset, and eventually it's commercialized today by Pfizer by the name of Ngenla. It's a long-acting growth hormone for pediatric growth hormone deficiency. So a lot of experience from the business side, from the development side. And in 2019, I rejoined forces with Enlivex current co-founder and executive chairman. And we kind of work together now on developing Allocetra. About Enlivex is a cell therapy company, very unique, very different cell therapy company with a platform technology that is targeting macrophages, and we know how to modulate those very unique cell. It's a completely new modality in treating inflammatory diseases. And by doing that, we're trying to rebalance the immune system. So we're targeting chronic and acute inflammatory diseases. We're in a clinical stage, and we're going to talk about the platform and the company more in details.
Great. Thank you for that, Oren. And I'm now going to turn the call over to Do Kim to ask several questions.
Thanks, Tim. Oren, thanks for being on the show. You had some recent, pretty interesting phase 1/2 data updated in knee osteoarthritis. But before we talk about that, wanted to start on the platform, and if you could describe the manufacturing process of your cell therapy and how it exactly works to reprogram macrophages.
Sure. So maybe I'll start quickly with the beginning. So actually, macrophages are very important immune cells. They are responsible for many different activities, but one of their roles is kind of what we call housekeeping. So they're clear dying cells. At every second in our body, cells are dying, naturally dying. We're not talking about cancer cells, and we're not talking about infected cells. We're talking about normal cells that need to renew themselves. So when they die, they need to be cleared out of the system in a very, very methodical way. Our immune system does not want to recognize those cells as something foreign, right? And attack the cells and so on. So somebody needs to clear them out and be mute about it when they do so. And that's exactly what macrophages are doing. So when we found out, our founder, Professor Mavoa from the Hadassah Hospital in Israel, he found out that macrophages are doing so. He thought, well, we can use that concept of uh, applying a lot of normal dying cells in order to shift inflammatory diseases. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're actually manufacturing normal dying cells. So we take normal mononuclear cells from healthy donors. We kind of expose them to certain conditions, very, very simple, but I think that's the beauty of this technology. And once we do that, they expose what we call eat me signal over the membrane. And then we inject those cells into the patient. and the patient's macrophages identify those dying cells. Just because they identify this universal eat me signal, they engulf them as a result. And consequently, what we have is a reprogramming of those macrophages. They become pro-resolution, anti-inflammatory macrophages, and doing so, they actually bring down the immune system back into homeostasis, what we call a normal state. So that's the technology. We manufacture those cells pretty easily. We don't transfect them. We don't expand them, so it's cost effective. And I think it's a very bright and simple idea.
If you're changing the inflammatory environment by conditioning these pro-inflammatory macrophages back into homeostasis, could that ultimately interfere with the natural inflammatory function that these macrophages have against, let's say, pathogens? Do you have potentially permanent changes because of this?
Well, actually, no. I think what's the beauty about this is that it kind of relies again. I think maybe people are more aware of the GLP versus insulin, right? So
Mhm.
insulin will take down your sugar, your blood sugar, regardless of what exactly is the situation, because that's the way it works. But GLP-1 will eventually lead to the fact that only if you have high sugar levels, it brings it down. So it's kind of a more naturally occurring process in that sense. That's more or less what we're doing. We're not inhibiting macrophages activity. We're modulating it in an environment where they're actually continue to push the inflammatory situation where it's not required, right? So the idea is that we shift them into a promostatic state, but in the specific environment that we are talking about, if eventually there will be for instance, an infection, and those macrophages need to respond, they pick up the relevant signal from the environment and actually respond again and change their activity, right? So it's not inhibition using an antibody or something like that. It's just promoting them to become more pro-resolution cells.
So I guess this is why it's more ideal to use a cell therapy rather than attempt to reprogram these macrophages with, like you said, an antibody or a small molecule. Is that an approach that could be taken, but you prefer you not go that course because you could have those potentially dangerous effects?
Well, I think the approach is, as you said, I think it's holistic, right? It's, the immune system is such a complex, and definitely, but the pathophysiology of different indications that we're targeting is very, very complex. In some cases, you have the luxury of neutralizing one or two cytokines, and it works pretty good. And for instance, in rheumatoid arthritis, however, in osteoarthritis, for instance, another disease, it's a more complex situation. And just targeting a specific molecule or a specific interaction or specific cytokine is not enough. You need something more holistic. And actually remodeling those macrophages, it's exactly what we're doing, in the sense that it's an holistic approach that allows those macrophages in various ways, right, to shift their phenotype and their activity, and to do so with the rest of the immune system as they change their activity. It's not just a single molecule, a single interaction. And I think that's very, very important, where in diseases where we failed to do so with a very more specific approach.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I know you've run a couple of studies in knee OA and different type of patients, meaning in severity. Could you review the type of patients that have been treated so far and the treatment effect you're seeing, especially the recent phase 1 update that has everyone kind of excited?
Sure. So we do have several studies in osteoarthritis. Osteoarthritis can occur, just as a quick background, it's a really serious condition, and one of the most life debilitating disease. Very, very common. We're talking about 10% of US adults with osteoarthritis, and the most common joint is the knee. That's the weight-bearing joint, the one that we use the most, and that's the most common one. I think something like 14 million adults in the US suffer from knee osteoarthritis. So the numbers are huge, and currently what we're doing is really giving them pain relief, and eventually they're doing knee replacement surgery. We'll probably get to that later. We have several studies, two studies in osteoarthritis, and one in what we call the TMJ, the jaw osteoarthritis, one in the basal thumb osteoarthritis, and we have others in psoriatic arthritis and so on. So the leading one in knee osteoarthritis and is the end stage, which means patients that are already indicated for knee replacement surgery. That's a study that we started. That's the first study where we dosed knee osteoarthritis patients, mainly to generate safety data, right? Like that was the first time we're injecting Allocetra directly into the knee. But actually, we saw in many of the patients that we treated a very dramatic pain relief, which caught us a little bit by surprise. But from those patients, the one with more inflammatory profile could respond to Allocetra. The next study that we're now running, and that's I think the largest and most important one in that sense, is in moderate to severe knee osteoarthritis. So in osteoarthritis, we have kind of grading. Without getting too much into the details, the KL grade is from 0 to 4. 0 is completely healthy. 4 means that you don't have any more cartilage. It's an end-stage patient. But the majority of the population are actually in that process, right? What we call KL2 and 3. That's the moderate to severe population that we're targeting. And we're running a phase 1/2 study. The phase 1 part of the study is an open label that we already completed. It was dose escalation to go to a dose that we feel safe. Then we had an independent safety committee reviewing the data and allowed us to move to the second part of the study, which is a phase 2 study. And that study is a randomized, controlled, double-blind study that we run in multi-centers, Europe, top-notch KOLs that are involved in that study design and execution. And 134 patients were treated. We just announced recently that we've completed enrollment to that study. So we're expecting to get 3 months top-line data, latest by August this year, so just really around the corner. And we don't know what the results will be, but we do know that from the phase 1 open label study, where we treated 15 patients overall, we monitor their response. And response here means pain, mainly pain, right? Patients with osteoarthritis eventually suffer from a lot of pain that limits their activity, simple things like walking, climbing stairs and stuff. And that's the endpoint that the FDA expects you to have in your phase 3, reduction in pain compared to placebo. And so we monitor that in those patients, and we saw at 3 months and 6 months an average 50% pain drop in those patients, more than 45% improvement in their activity, and around 40% reduction in their stiffness at the knee of the knee. So very, very promising and encouraging data from our perspective. It's an open label, right? So we need to get the randomized control data for sure. But it's a very, very good start. And it's aligned with what we expect, because macrophages play a pivotal role in the development and the chronic state and the progression of osteoarthritis. So in that sense, targeting, these are the main immune cells that are involved in osteoarthritis. So targeting those cells and changing the inflammatory microenvironment could eventually lead to an improvement of the inflammatory component and resulting in a substantial relief in pain.
Right. So I think what's kind of unique about your cell therapy is that other cell therapies have attempted to treat knee osteoarthritis and look for disease modifying, but they haven't been able to reduce the pain. And pain is, like you said, a very key endpoint for the FDA. Your goal is it ultimately to be disease modifying in a potential treatment in knee osteoarthritis, or are you just content with lowering the pain and covering what the FDA wants?
It's a great question, and the answer is both. As you mentioned, I think that's important for people who are less familiar with osteoarthritis to understand that yes, people are losing their cartilage, and eventually, if they completely lost their cartilage, they have bone over bone, and that's painful. That's a mechanical pain. But actually, most of the pain component comes from the inflammatory component of the disease, right? So and you can, if you inject steroids to those patients, you actually they experience a substantial pain relief, but it takes about 2-3 months, depends on the situation, to get a rebound of that pain, because it doesn't really change the core of the disease. And so what we're doing is actually there's a vicious cycle there, right? The cartilage is degraded, releases pro-inflammatory factors that attract immune cells, mostly a precursor of macrophages that eventually become pro-inflammatory macrophages. They promote inflammation, and that leads to further cartilage degradation. And then you get this, this cycle over and over again. What we're trying to do is really to change that environment by targeting modulating those macrophages. And eventually that could cut off that vicious cycle. So it's not a pain relief. The pain is the consequences of all what I just described, but that's not what we're targeting. It's an indirect effect in that sense. So it is potentially a disease modifying drug, and that's what we're targeting. But whether that will result in cartilage growth, I at this stage we don't know. We really don't know. We know that drugs that try to regrowth cartilage, like FGF18, they work pretty good in cartilage regrowth, but they didn't work in relieving pain. It's disconnected, so to speak. And I think what we're trying to do is really to change the environment, and by that relieving the pain, and to have a more durable effect eventually than what we see with steroids, which you cannot continue to inject steroids, right? There's a safety consequences to that as well. That's the limitation of using steroids. Otherwise, it was a legitimate treatment, to be honest. But
Yeah,
that's the problem with that.
I think one of the challenges, or definitely the challenge for a randomized placebo-controlled trial in knee osteoarthritis is that you tend to have a very high placebo effect. And if you look at the approved therapies, the benefit on the pain score is very narrow, sometimes very narrowly statistically significant. When you look at this single-arm treatment data, how confident, or what gives you confidence that this enough to be placebo?
Right. So I think three elements. First is you can see heterogeneity in the sense of what is the level of placebo response in those studies. There's always a placebo response, and we can have just a chapter about an episode about that, because it's a fascinating story. But you need to control the study in a sense that you will reduce the placebo effect to a certain level, to the lower end of that range that we just described, which is somewhere between 25 to 30%. And we're running the study with a very experienced CRO and with a very experienced sites that been there. That's the core of their business, so to speak, is running osteoarthritis studies. So you don't want to overpromise, for instance, the patients. That's one element. If you get a patient and you're saying, you got to get into the study, right? Well, this will definitely help you. Then his expectations are such that the placebo effect will just fly out, or become insane. You want to manage that, and there are ways to do that, and we've educated ourselves and worked with KOLs and so on to really manage that part. So that's one aspect. The other aspect really comes with the So we're seeing magnitude in the open label part of about 50% drop, 3 months, 6 months, and even more. We're seeing more than 80% respond rates, right? So if you look at the literature, I think that puts us at the high end of the range of other studies that managed to see, 30, 40% pain drop. And this is really the first study, right? We have additional uh characterizations that we're doing as part of the study to have an even better understanding on the mode of action of what potentially is a responder that will probably will be able to implement that in the follow-up studies, right? So that's another aspect. And really the combination of all those things that I just described, the fact that the mode of action is targeting macrophages, and we know that macrophages are critical in osteoarthritis. So all of those components together, if you consolidate them into one perception, I think that we are very optimistic. But as you said, right, we need to be cautious here. We're waiting for the randomized control data. We're completely blinded. So
Right. Right. And you said you're expecting the phase 2 portion around August, and I'm assuming that you've gone through the statistical powering and you know what the possible effects of the placebo group is and what you need for significance. Let's move to, and if the phase 2 data is positive, what are the next steps? Well, what do you do in your current situation? I think you may need 2 phase 3 trials to get approval. Does that include a partnering strategy?
yes, so you're completely right that basically FDA and also EMA, but FDA mainly expects two phase 3 studies. They could be identical, or you can run them in parallel. So, but there is an expectation to have those two studies separately, to run those two studies separately. The next step will be a phase 2b3 study and an additional phase 3 study in line with which we just described. We definitely need, although we currently are well budgeted all the way to the end of 2026 for that study, and we will need to do an additional financing, or potentially to collaborate, right? So that's definitely an option that is on the table. Um, we are discussing and we'll continue to discuss, obviously, if the data is positive, to leverage that data into potential partnership with, with other pharma companies, something similar to what we did, with the previous company. To be honest, what we had in Prolor, which was eventually Opco Biologics, was that we've presented the data in conferences. We had discussions with many big pharma, including Pfizer. I was meeting them in every conference and in the endocrinology with the same team, presenting our progress and so on. And when we had the phase 2 data, which was based on a sizable study, quality data, and good efficacy and safety, that allowed us eventually to mature into a licensing agreement. And I think that's something we're definitely will follow here, if the data is positive.
And even looking further beyond that, if Allocetra gets approved and there aren't really very good options on the market for, advanced, moderate, severe progression of disease treatments, and ultimately you want to avoid going into surgery, how do you think about where Allocetra will fit in this market, and consider what the pricing would be when you're looking at, generic pain medications that cost practically nothing but really don't do much, or the other approved injectable therapies that doesn't really halt the disease, but are priced at much higher premium.
Right. So I think, again, it's a great question. So we talked about what's the major segment, right? And the major segment are the moderate to severe patients. So they're not at the end of the end stage part of the disease, which means that really they will go through a surgery. Most of the patients have a slow progression that takes about 10, 15, 20 years until they get to that stage. So this is the population that we're targeting, and probably more specifically the one with the more inflammatory component, the inflammatory phenotype, because that's the mode of action. But actually, that's the majority of the osteoarthritis patient. In terms of pricing, we can go back to what I just said in the beginning of this discussion, which is this is a very cost-effective drug, right? We Our pharmacoeconomical model is such that we think we'll be pricing this drug in a very competitive way, which is in the same price range of those high-end drugs that you described just now, like hyaluronic acid or PRP treatment. But this one will be a demo effective one, right? So it's a different ball game. I think that we still need to have the final dose, so I'll be able to say something more specifically, but we will be very competitive in that sense. And we need to remember we're not competing with pain reliefs. I mean, that's not that's not what we do. The outcome is pain relief, but the mechanism of action is completely different. And as such, that's not the price that we're comparing ourselves. But it's definitely will be a very competitive pricing.
Very fantastic. I think we could discuss on this for a lot longer, and I'd love to have you back when you have your phase 2 data. But right now, I think we're ready to close the time, and I'm going to hand it back over to Tim, and he's going to ask you one more question, and we'll wrap it up. Thanks, Oren.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think
Thank you
we're
very
all
much.
set. This has really been fascinating, though. So thank you for joining us today. Oren Hershkovitz, PhD, CEO of Enlivex Therapeutics, NASDAQ ticker symbol ENLV. And thanks to my equity research colleague, Do Kim, for also joining us today. And finally, a special thanks to the producer and editor of the podcast, Joe Brunetto. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, as well as visiting www.watertowerresearch.com to stay up to speed on the company's small cap written research reports, podcasts, fireside chats, and conference schedules. We will see you the next time for another edition of the WTR Small Cap Spotlight podcast.